A young boy waits every night at a bus stop for his father to return. Officer John, who initially thought he was just a troublemaker, hears his story and can't hold back his tears. How will this encounter change their lives? Find out in this touching story. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next videos. Officer John Reynolds had been on the force for over 15 years. He was a seasoned policeman, hardened by the routines of night patrols in his suburban district. The streets were usually quiet after dark, filled with nothing more than the occasional hum of distant traffic or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. For John, these patrols were as monotonous as they were predictable, a time for him to clear his mind and remind himself of his duty to keep the streets safe from trouble. Over the years, his experiences had taught him to trust his instincts and be wary of anything that seemed out of place. His stern demeanor and quick judgments often defined his interactions with others, especially when it came to those he perceived as troublemakers. One chilly autumn evening, as he cruised down the familiar roads in his patrol car, John's eyes were drawn to a small figure curled up on a bench at a bus stop. He slowed his car to a crawl, his headlights casting a stark, almost accusatory light on the scene. There, huddled under a thin blanket, was a young black boy, no older than 10, his small body shivering in the cold. John felt his jaw tighten. Another runaway or some homeless kid, he muttered to himself, probably up to no good. His initial reaction, shaped by years of seeing similar situations, was to keep driving. He had dealt with enough troubled youths in his time to know that most were just looking for trouble or a quick handout. He shook his head and continued on his patrol, his mind already moving on to the next potential issue, a flickering street lamp or a broken fence. Yet, as the night wore on, John found his thoughts drifting back to the boy. The image of him lying there alone, wrapped in a flimsy blanket, tugged at something deep within him. It's not my problem, he thought, almost convincing himself, but something didn't sit right. There was a nagging feeling in his chest that he couldn't shake. On his next circuit around the neighborhood, he noticed the boy still there, unmoved, still huddled against the cold. His irritation fled up again. What is he doing there? John thought. Doesn't he have somewhere to go? This time, John decided to stop. He pulled his patrol car over and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the bus stop. The boy didn't stir, even as John's shadow fell over him. Up close, he looked even smaller, more fragile. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and his eyes, half opened, revealed a weary emptiness. "Hey, kid," John said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "What are you doing out here this late?" The boy flinched at the sudden voice, but didn't move otherwise. His eyes blinked open fully, and he looked up at John with a mixture of fear and confusion. I'm waiting for my dad," he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the night air. John raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in his expression. "Waiting for your dad? At this hour? Does he know you're out here?" The boy nodded slightly, though his eyes didn't meet John's. He said he'd come back for me. "Right here," he added, pointing to the bus stop sign above him. "So I wait here every night." John couldn't help the incredulous laugh that escaped his lips. "Every night, kid? How long have you been doing this?" The boy hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an answer. "A long time," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, but he promised he'd come back. John's initial irritation was slowly being replaced by a gnawing sense of pity, but his skepticism remained strong. He had heard plenty of stories from kids trying to get out of trouble. "Look, kid," he began, softening his tone only slightly. "It's not safe out here at night. You should be home, in bed. Where's your mom?" The boy's face fell, and his small frame seemed to shrink even further. "She's sick," he said quietly. "Real sick. She can't come out here. I gotta wait for him. He'll come back. He always comes back." John sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He was torn between his duty to ensure the boy's safety and his frustration at the situation. He decided to press further. "What's your name, kid?" "Eric," the boy answered, glancing up briefly before looking away again. "Eric," John repeated, trying to assess the boy's story. "Listen, Eric, I can't leave you out here like this. It's too cold, and this isn't a safe place for a kid to be alone. Why don't I give you a ride somewhere safe? We can figure out where your dad is and get you home." Eric shook his head firmly. "No, sir. I gotta stay here. This is where he said to wait. Right here." John's patience was wearing thin, but he couldn't help feeling a pang of empathy for the boy. He knew what it was like to be alone, to wait for someone who might never come. But he also knew the streets, and he knew that leaving Eric here wasn't an option. "All right," John said, taking a step back. "I'll check on you again later, okay? But you can't stay here all night. It's too dangerous." Eric nodded, though his expression remained distant, almost defeated. John returned to his patrol car, his mind churning with thoughts. As he drove away, he glanced back in his rearview mirror and saw Eric sitting back down on the bench, pulling his thin blanket tighter around himself. The night stretched on, and John continued his rounds, but he couldn't shake the image of Eric sitting alone at the bus stop. The boy's quiet determination to stay there, waiting for a father who might never return, weighed heavily on him. He remembered the look in Eric's eyes, a mixture of hope and resignation, and it stirred something deep within him. When he circled back again later that night, Eric was still there, now lying down with his eyes closed. Though John couldn't tell if he was asleep or just resting, his heart sank a little. He knew he couldn't just leave the boy out here again. John parked his car and got out once more. This time, his approach was softer. "Eric," he called gently. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and he sat up slowly. "Hey," John said, crouching down to meet Eric at eye level. "I brought you something warm to drink." He handed the boy a cup of hot chocolate from his thermos. Eric hesitated before taking it, his small hands trembling slightly from the cold. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, taking a careful sip. The warmth seemed to bring a bit of color back to his cheeks. John watched him for a moment, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. "Eric," he said softly, "I know you're waiting for your dad, but you can't stay out here every night like this. It's not safe." Eric looked down, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "He promised," he whispered. "He promised he'd come back." John felt a lump forming in his throat. He could see the pain in Eric's eyes, the kind that only comes from someone who's lost something precious. He knew that feeling all too well. He had lost his own family to distance and time, and now this boy was clinging to the last shred of hope he had left. For the first time in a long while, John felt his hardened exterior begin to crack. He didn't know what to say to Eric, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. "All right, kid," he said, his voice softer than before. "I'll be back tomorrow. We'll figure this out together. You hear me?" Eric nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Yes, sir. Thank you." As John walked back to his car, he felt the cold night air cut through him. But it wasn't just the temperature that chilled him. It was the realization that he couldn't ignore this boy's plight any longer. Something had to change, and maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to make that change happen. With a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, John drove off into the night, knowing that he would be back the next evening, and every evening after that, until he could help Eric find the answers he was so desperately seeking. The next few nights, Officer John Reynolds found himself driving past the same bus stop, almost against his own will. Each time he slowed down, his eyes searching for that small figure he'd come to expect. And each time, there was Eric, sitting alone on the bench, bundled in his thin coat, his eyes fixed on the empty street, as if his very will could conjure his father's return. John had never seen such stubborn determination in someone so young. At first, it frustrated him. Why would a kid choose to wait here every night instead of finding a safer place? But the more he watched, the more his frustration began to mix with something else, something that felt like concern. On the third night, the weather had turned colder. The wind was harsher, carrying a bite that pierced through even John's thick police jacket. As he pulled up to the bus stop, he saw Eric, huddled into himself, his small body shivering. John sighed deeply, feeling a pull in his chest he didn't fully understand. He decided it was time to change his approach. He walked over to Eric, who looked up at him with those wide, tired eyes. "Hey, kid," John said, trying to sound less like a cop and more like someone who cared. "You're gonna freeze out here. It's getting colder." Eric just nodded slightly, his face pale from the cold. "I'm okay," he murmured. "I'm waiting for my dad." John felt his irritation rise, but he swallowed it back. He had to be patient. "I know you are, Eric," he said, his voice softer than before. "But maybe it's time we talk about finding a warmer place while you wait. I can help you get somewhere safe tonight." Eric shook his head, his eyes suddenly sharp with fear. "No, sir. If I leave, he might not find me." He said to wait right here. John exhaled slowly, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "Eric, it's been a long time since you've seen your dad, right? Are you sure he's coming back?" Eric's lower lip quivered, and for a moment, John thought he might cry. But the boy just blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "He promised," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He promised he'd come back for me." The weight of those words settled heavily in John's chest. He could hear the pain and desperation in Eric's voice, a pain he recognized all too well. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for his earlier assumptions. Here was a kid who had lost almost everything, holding on to the only bit of hope he had left. "All right," John said quietly, sitting down on the bench beside Eric. "But at least let me bring you something to keep you warm." He returned to his patrol car and pulled out an old, thick blanket he kept in the trunk. He wrapped it around Eric, who looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, sir," Eric whispered, pulling the blanket tight around his small frame. John nodded, his heart heavy. "I'll check on you later, okay?" Eric nodded, his eyes still focused on the road ahead. Waiting, always. Waiting. As the nights passed, John's visits to Eric became more frequent. He'd bring hot chocolate, sandwiches, and once even a small flashlight for the boy to use when it got dark. Each time, Eric accepted these offerings with a quiet thankfulness, but his resolve never wavered. He remained at the bus stop, watching, waiting. One night, as John handed Eric a cup of hot soup from the local diner, he couldn't help but ask, "What's your favorite memory with your dad, Eric?" Eric looked up, his eyes lighting up for the first time in days. "There was this one time," he began, his voice filled with a small but genuine warmth, "when he took me to the park after school. We played catch, and he bought me ice cream. He said he'd always take care of me, no matter what." John listened, feeling his chest tighten with emotion. The story was simple, but the way Eric told it, with such longing and innocence, made John's heart ache. He realized that this little boy wasn't just waiting for his father. He was waiting for a sense of security, for a promise that he hadn't yet realized had been broken. "Eric," John said carefully, "I know it's hard, but sometimes people make promises they can't keep." Eric's face fell, his small hands gripping the cup tightly. "But he wouldn't lie to me," he said softly. He said he'd come back. John felt the sting of tears behind his eyes, but he blinked them away. He knew he had to keep his composure. I'm sure he meant it when he said it, Eric, he replied. But sometimes life changes things. It doesn't mean he didn't love you. Eric looked down, and for a moment, John thought he might have pushed too far. But then Eric spoke, his voice barely audible. I just want to see him again. John didn't know how to respond. He sat there in silence, his mind racing. He wanted to tell Eric that everything would be okay, that his father would come back and make things right. But he couldn't lie to the kid. He knew better than to give false hope. That night, as John drove home, he couldn't shake the image of Eric's hopeful face. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath was shallow, his mind a whirlpool of emotions. And then, to his own surprise, he felt tears streaming down his face. It had been years since John had cried. He had built walls around his emotions, convinced himself that he didn't need anyone or anything. But something about Eric's story, his unwavering belief that his father would return, broke through those walls. It reminded John of his own losses, of the family he'd lost touch with, of the life he'd let slip away. As he sat there, he realized that he couldn't just leave things as they were. He couldn't keep driving past that bus stop every night, watching a little boy's heart slowly break. He had to do something. He had to help. The next day, John began making calls. He started with the local shelters and hospitals, asking if anyone had seen a man matching the description Eric had given him. He checked police records, looked through missing persons reports, and even reached out to neighboring precincts. His colleagues were surprised to see him so invested in this case. John, who was always so detached, so focused on the next task. But now, there was a fire in his eyes, a determination that none of them had seen before. Each dead end only fueled his resolve. He knew he couldn't give up. Eric needed answers, and John felt like he owed it to him to find them. That evening, when John returned to the bus stop, Eric was there, as always. But this time, John could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of disappointment. He sat down beside Eric, handing him another cup of hot chocolate. Hey, buddy, he said gently. I've been looking for your dad. Been asking around, trying to find out where he might be. Eric's eyes widened a bit, a flicker of hope sparking to life. Did you find him? John shook his head, his expression somber. Not yet. But I'm not giving up, okay? We'll keep looking. Together. Eric nodded, his small hands wrapped around the warm cup. Thank you, Officer John, he whispered. For the first time, John felt a genuine smile tug at his lips. You don't have to thank me, Eric. We're in this together, remember? They sat there in silence for a while, the cold night air wrapping around them. But for John, the chill didn't seem so harsh anymore. He was beginning to see things differently, not just his duty as a policeman, but his duty as a human being, as someone who could make a difference in another person's life. That night, as he drove away, he made a promise to himself. He would find Eric's father, or at least find out what happened to him. He couldn't stand the thought of leaving Eric alone in the dark, clinging to a hope that might never be realized. He had to help the boy find closure, whatever form it took. And so, John prepared himself for the journey ahead, knowing that it wouldn't be easy, but certain that it was the right thing to do. Eric needed him, and for the first time in a long time, John felt like he had a real purpose. Determined to find answers for Eric, Officer John Reynolds began his search in earnest. He spent his days digging through records, making phone calls, and following every lead he could find. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the way he was suddenly so focused, so intent on helping this one boy. For John, it wasn't just about doing his job anymore. It was personal. He started by reaching out to local shelters and hospitals, hoping to find a trace of Eric's father. John learned that the man had worked various odd jobs in the area before disappearing a few years back. There were whispers of him falling on the hard times, struggling with addiction, and ultimately drifting away. But every time John thought he was getting closer, he hit another dead end. The frustration was mounting, but John was relentless. He knew he couldn't give up. Eric had deserved to know the truth, whatever it might be. One evening, after another long day of dead ends, John drove to the bus stop where Eric always waited. As usual, the boy was there, bundled in the thick blanket John had given him, his eyes fixed on the road. When he saw John approach, a flicker of hope crossed his face. "Officer John," Eric said softly, looking up with tired eyes. "Did you find him?" John shook his head, crouching down to be at eye level with the boy. "Not yet, buddy," he replied, his voice filled with regret. "But I'm still looking. I promise I'm not giving up." Eric's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trying." John's heart ached at the sight of the boy's quiet resignation. He wanted so badly to give Eric the news he was hoping for. But he knew he had to keep going, had to keep searching. He couldn't let this boy's spirit break. The next day, John decided to dig deeper. He started visiting the places where Eric's father had once worked, speaking to anyone who might have known him. At a local diner, he found a waitress who remembered the man. She recalled him as kind but troubled, always looking for work and often talking about his son. She hadn't seen him in years, but mentioned that he had talked about leaving town to start over. John's next stop was a construction site on the edge of town. The foreman there remembered Eric's father, too. "Good worker," he said. "Quiet guy, kept to himself. Heard he had some problems, though. One day, he just stopped showing up." "Did he say where he was going?" John asked, hope flickering in his chest. The foreman shook his head. "No, just that he needed a fresh start." Never saw him again after that. Each conversation seemed to lead to the same conclusion. Eric's father had left town, searching for something, a new beginning, perhaps, or a way to escape his demons. But where he had gone, no one seemed to know. John refused to let the trail go cold. He reached out to nearby precincts, checking if there were any records of Eric's father. He called shelters in neighboring towns, hospitals, and even rehab centers, hoping to find a trace. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, John's determination only grew stronger. As the search continued, John found himself spending more time with Eric. Every evening, after his shift, he'd drive to the bus stop to see the boy. They'd sit together, sharing stories and small comforts in the cold night air. John had never been one for emotional conversations, but with Eric, it felt different. It felt right. "Tell me more about your mom," John said one night as they sat together on the bench, a thermos of hot soup between them. Eric's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She's really nice," he said. "Even when she's sick, she tries to make me feel better. She used to read me stories every night before bed. I miss that." John nodded, listening intently. He could see the pain in Eric's eyes, but also the love. It reminded him of his own childhood, of the moments he'd taken for granted with his family. He wondered if there was more he could do for Eric, more than just searching for his father. "Does she know you're out here waiting for your dad?" John asked carefully. Eric hesitated, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I don't think so," he admitted. "She's been too sick to notice. I don't want to make her worry." John felt a pang of sadness. "You're a good kid, Eric," he said quietly. "You're doing the best you can." Eric looked up, his eyes searching John's face. Do you think he's ever coming back?" he asked, his voice trembling. John didn't know how to answer. He wanted to give Eric hope, to tell him that his father would come back and make everything right, but he knew he couldn't lie. "I don't know, buddy," he said honestly. "But I promise I'm going to keep looking. We're going to figure this out together." Eric nodded, his expression filled with both sadness and trust. For the first time, John realized just how much this boy needed him, needed someone to believe in, someone to count on. And in that moment, John made a silent vow. He wouldn't let Eric down. One afternoon, John got a call from a social worker who had worked with Eric's family in the past. She remembered his father and had heard rumors that he might have headed south to a small town where he had some distant relatives. John immediately followed up on the lead, reaching out to the local authorities in that area. After a few days, he received a response. One of the officers in the small town remembered seeing a man who matched the description, but he had left just as quickly as he had come. He was reportedly in bad shape, struggling with his own battles, and seemed to be drifting from place to place. The news was a blow, but John wasn't ready to give up. He knew he was getting closer, and he couldn't stop now. He drove to the town himself, following the trail of a man who seemed to be running from his past, from his responsibilities. John spent the day speaking to anyone who might have seen Eric's father. He learned that the man had been living in shelters, picking up odd jobs where he could, and then moving on. It was a lonely existence, and John couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for both the man and his son, who had been left behind. As he drove back to his own town that evening, John's mind was heavy with the weight of it all. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever, chasing a ghost, a man who might not even want to be found. But he also knew he couldn't give up on Eric, not after everything. Back at the bus stop, Eric was waiting as usual. When John pulled up, the boy stood, his face filled with cautious hope. John got out of the car, his expression serious. "I found out some things," he began, sitting down on the bench beside Eric. "It sounds like your dad's been moving around a lot. He's having a hard time, but I don't know where he is right now." Eric's face fell, his eyes filling with tears. "So he's not coming back?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. John's heart broke at the sight of the boy's anguish. He reached out, placing a hand on Eric's shoulder. "I don't know, Eric, but what I do know is that you've been waiting here long enough. You deserve better than this. You deserve to feel safe and loved." Eric sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "I just wanted to see him again," he murmured. John nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "I know, buddy, and I promise I'm going to keep looking. But in the meantime, I want you to know that you don't have to wait here alone anymore. You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." Eric looked up at him, his eyes wide and searching. "You promise?" he asked. John nodded, his throat tight. "I promise, Eric, with all my heart." For the first time, Eric leaned into John, resting his head against the officer's shoulder. John wrapped an arm around the boy, holding him close. In that moment, he realized that this was more than just a search for a missing man. It was a search for connection, for family, for a sense of belonging that both of them had been missing. And as they sat there, under the dim streetlights of the bus stop, John knew he would do whatever it took to make sure Eric never felt alone again. Over the following days, Officer John Reynolds made it a point to continue his visits to the bus stop, where Eric still showed up each evening, despite the cold and the increasingly slim chances of his father returning. John knew he couldn't let the boy down, and he wanted to help him understand that sometimes the things we hope for don't always turn out the way we wish. One evening, after another round of calls and fruitless searching, John decided it was time to have a difficult conversation with Eric. The boy deserved the truth, and he needed to know that he didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. When John pulled up to the bus stop that night, Eric was already there, as always. his small frame bundled up in layers of clothing to keep warm. John could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of hope slowly turning into despair. It was a look John had seen in his own reflection more times than he cared to admit. John parked his car and walked over to the bench, sitting down beside Eric. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with that familiar mixture of hope and dread. John took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to say. "Eric," John began gently, "we need to talk." Eric's eyes widened a bit, and he shifted nervously. "Did you find him?" he asked, his voice small and filled with a fragile hope. John shook his head slowly, his expression soft but serious. "No, buddy, I didn't. And I've been looking everywhere I can think of. I've talked to a lot of people who knew your dad, and it sounds like he's been having a really tough time. He's been moving around a lot, trying to figure things out." Eric's face fell, his eyes beginning to glisten with tears. "So he's not coming back, is he?" he whispered, his voice trembling. John felt his own heart breaking at the sight of the boy's despair. He wanted to reach out and hold him, to shield him from the pain he was feeling, but he knew he had to be honest. "I don't know, Eric," he said softly, "but I think it's time we accept that he might not. And that's not your fault. You've been so brave, waiting here every night, believing in him, but sometimes people make promises they can't keep." Eric sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "But he said he'd come back," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "He promised." John nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know, buddy, and I'm sure he meant it when he said it. But things change. People change. And it's not because of anything you did or didn't do. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to handle things, and they make mistakes." Eric's shoulders shook with silent sobs, his small frame trembling. John felt his own eyes stinging with tears. He reached out, pulling the boy into a gentle embrace. "Hey," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's going to be okay. You've got me, okay? And I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Eric clung to him, his tears soaking into John's jacket. It was as if the weight of the world had finally been lifted from his small shoulders, and he could finally let go. John held him tightly, his heart breaking for the boy who had waited so long, who had hoped so fiercely. After a while, Eric pulled back, sniffling and wiping his face. What do I do now?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. John took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. "Well," he said carefully, "I think the first thing we do is get you somewhere warm and safe. You can't keep coming out here every night. It's not good for you. And I promise I'll keep looking for your dad. But I think it's time we focus on you, on making sure you're okay." Eric nodded slowly, his eyes still red from crying. "Okay," he whispered. "But where will I go?" John smiled softly, a sense of determination settling in his chest. "I've got an idea," he said. "How about you stay with me for a little while, just until we figure things out? I've got a spare room, and you'd be safe there. What do you think?" Eric looked up at him, his eyes wide with surprise. "You'd do that for me?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. John nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "Of course I would, Eric. You're not alone in this, not anymore." Eric managed a small smile, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "Okay," he said softly. "I'd like that." Over the next few days, John set about making arrangements for Eric to stay with him temporarily. He worked with social services to ensure everything was in order and visited Eric's mother in the hospital to discuss his plans. She was weak but grateful, her eyes filled with tears as she thanked John for everything he was doing for her son. John also took some time to prepare his home. It had been years since he'd had anyone stay with him, and the idea of having a child around was both daunting and oddly comforting. He cleared out the spare bedroom, set up a small bed, and even picked up a few toys and books he thought Eric might like. It wasn't much, but he wanted the boy to feel welcome, to feel like he had a place where he belonged. When the day finally came for Eric to move in, John could see the mixture of excitement and nervousness in the boy's eyes. He helped Eric carry his small backpack up to the spare room, showing him around and making sure he felt comfortable. "This is your space, buddy," John said with a smile. "You can make it your own." Eric looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's nice," he said quietly. "Thank you." John nodded, his heart full. "You're welcome, Eric. I'm glad you're here." As the days passed, John and Eric began to settle into a routine. John would go to work during the day, checking in on Eric regularly, and in the evenings they'd spend time together, cooking dinner, watching movies, or just talking. It was a new experience for both of them, but one that they both found surprisingly comforting. John hadn't realized how lonely he'd been until Eric came into his life. The boy's presence filled his house with a warmth that had been missing for so long. He found himself looking forward to coming home each day, to hearing Eric's stories, and seeing the small smile that had started to appear more frequently on his face. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Eric turned to John with a shy expression. "Officer John," he began, hesitating for a moment, Do you think my dad would be proud of me?" John felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, placing a hand on Eric's shoulder. "I think he would be, Eric. I think he'd be very proud of you. You're a brave kid, and you've been through a lot. But you're still here, and you're still hoping. That takes a lot of strength." Eric nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I just wish he was here to see it." John's heart ached for the boy, but he also felt a deep sense of pride in him. "I know, buddy," he said softly, "but you've got people here who see you, who care about you. You're not alone." Eric managed a small smile, leaning against John's side. "Thanks, Officer John," he whispered, "for everything." John wrapped an arm around him, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Anytime, kid," he said quietly. "Anytime." As weeks turned into months, the bond between John and Eric continued to grow. John found himself becoming more than just a temporary guardian. He was becoming a father figure, someone Eric could rely on. And for John, the experience was transformative. He began to see his work, his life, and his community through a new lens, one of compassion, empathy, and connection. One day, while they were out for a walk, Eric looked up at John with a thoughtful expression. "Officer John," he said slowly, "is it okay if I call you Dad sometimes?" John stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. He looked down at Eric, his eyes wide with surprise and emotion. You want to call me Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Yeah," he said. "You take care of me like a dad would. And I like that." John felt his eyes sting with tears. He crouched down to Eric's level, his hands resting on the boy's shoulders. "Eric," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd be honored if you called me Dad." Eric's face broke into a wide smile, and he threw his arms around John's neck, hugging him tightly. John held him close, his own heart overflowing with love and gratitude. In that moment, he realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a family. As they continued their walk, hand in hand, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. He wasn't just Officer John anymore. He was Dad, and that made all the difference. The months that followed were filled with new beginnings. Eric began attending school again, making friends and starting to rebuild his life. John continued to search for Eric's father, keeping his promise to the boy. But he also made sure to focus on the present, on the life they were building together. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Eric looked up at John with a serious expression. "Dad," he said, the words still new, but feeling more natural with each use. "I just want you to know, even if we don't find him, I'm glad I found you." John felt his heart swell with emotion. He reached across the table, taking Eric's hand in his. "I'm glad I found you too, Eric," he said softly. "You've changed my life in ways I never expected." And as they sat there, sharing a simple meal in their cozy home, both John and Eric knew that they had found something special, a new hope, a new family, and a new beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this. And don't forget to check out our other videos. You won't want to miss them.